Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a powerful and often provocative book, The State Against Blacks by Walter E. Williams. We're looking specifically at the third printing from 1982.
Yeah, this is a really significant work. It definitely challenges some standard ways of thinking about economic inequality.
It really does. It presents a counter-narrative, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Williams's central idea, his thesis, it's quite counterintuitive, especially for the time it was written. He fully acknowledges the history of racial bigotry, no question there.
Right.
But he argues that bigotry alone isn't the most important, or maybe not the complete, explanation for the economic challenges many Black Americans were facing then. And, arguably still face.
What does he point to instead?
He zeroes in on what he calls the rules of the game. Think federal, state, local laws. Basically, the regulations governing economic activity. These, he says, are the primary barrier.
Okay, so laws that might look race-neutral on the surface.
Exactly. But he argues they systematically stack the deck against certain people. He describes them as outsiders, latecomers, and the poor in resources.
And given American history, Black Americans often fall into that category.
Disproportionately so, yes.
So our mission today is really to unpack that argument, look at the evidence Williams brings, see how he connects all these different regulations, minimum wage, licensing, back to this core idea.
Sounds good. Let's dig in.
All right. So where does he start? He acknowledges the disparities, right?
Right.
Lower income, education levels.
Yes, he starts right there. He lays out the widely recognized facts. Lower income, educational achievement, occupational status, employment stability for Black Americans compared to others. But then he immediately pivots.
How so?
He challenges some deeply held assumptions about how to achieve progress, like the idea that things can't get better without, say, society becoming more benevolent or Black Americans gaining more political power first. His focus is quite different.
That is provocative. And I remember reading, he starts by redefining some key terms. That seems crucial.
It's fundamental to his whole argument. Take racial preference.
Yeah. How does he define that?
He strips it right down. For Williams, racial preference is just an individual taste, like preferring French wine over Californian or a Ford over a Chevy.
So not inherently malicious.
Not necessarily in his definition. He says it's an attribute, could be unchangeable, and it can lead to a disadvantage for the group that's less preferred in certain situations. But it's rooted in individual choice in this specific framework.
Okay. And then there's racial prejudice. We usually think of that as, irrational hate.
Right. But Williams offers a different angle. He defines prejudice not as hate, but as prejudgment, making a decision with incomplete information.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. Gathering information costs time and effort, right? We all try to save on those costs. His analogy might be like seeing a snake. You don't stop to figure out if it's poisonous. You react based on a general prejudged idea about snakes. He applies that same, maybe controversial logic to human interactions. People might make decisions based on group traits to minimize information costs.
Okay. So then racial discrimination is just the act.
It's the act of choosing, where race is the deciding factor. But here's his key point, the really interesting part. In a truly free market, he argues, economically irrational preferences, like, say, an employer refusing to hire productive Black workers just because of their race, that preference would actually cost the employer.
How so?
Because they'd be passing up productive workers, potentially losing out to competitors who do hire them. So the market itself would make that kind of discrimination unprofitable.
Right. It imposes a cost.
Exactly. And this ties into another thing. He challenges the idea that, say, residential segregation always means racial injustice or is purely driven by dislike.
Okay. What's his alternative explanation?
He points to economic and class factors. These often correlate with race, of course, but he suggests they can create similar patterns through just voluntary individual choices. Poor people tend to live near other poor people, regardless of race, often due to housing costs.
He mentions a study, doesn't he? Schnorr.
Yeah, Leo F. Schnorr, showing that as non-white income and education levels rise, they tend to move further from the city centers, similar to white patterns, suggesting class segregation within the Black community itself.
And he even talks about Black flight to the suburbs for similar reasons as white flight, better schools, crime concerns.
Right, all of which complicates the narrative that it's purely about race when, say, a suburb resists low-income housing.
So the big takeaway here, for you listening, is that Williams is saying, look, if we get the diagnosis wrong, if we only focus on bigotry,
then our policy solutions might be ineffective or even make things worse.
Okay, so if that's the framework, what specific rules of the game does he really dissect? The minimum wage chapter comes up a lot.
Yes, Chapter 3. That's a classic example for him. He looks at things like the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Well-intentioned, sure, but they set a price floor for labor, and here's the kicker, he says. The government can mandate a wage, but it can't magically make a worker more productive to match that wage. And it can't force an employer to hire someone whose productivity is below that mandated level.
Which leads to invisible victims, as he calls them.
Precisely. If the minimum wage is set higher than what a particular worker can produce in value, employers, acting rationally, will hire someone else who is more productive.
And this hits certain groups harder.
Disproportionately impacts marginal workers, he argues. Often young people and significantly racial minorities, often due to disadvantages in education or experience. And it's not just about not getting that job.
What else?
It's about missing out on the chance to get any job, even a low-paying one, to gain skills, experience, work habits. All that on-the-job training gets blocked off too.
The stats he cites are pretty stark. Black youth unemployment being multiples of white youth unemployment.
Yeah, 2 to 3 times, sometimes hitting, over 60% in some cities back then. He connects that directly to the effects of the minimum wage.
And he also delves into why these laws get supported, sometimes for reasons that aren't just about helping low-wage workers.
That's a really interesting part. He talks about unions, for example, cites the South African Building Workers Union, where minimum wages were explicitly used to price black workers, who were often lower skilled at the time, out of competition with white workers.
So using the minimum wage to protect higher skilled workers' jobs.
Essentially creating a kind of monopoly power for the higher skilled group, yeah.
Huh.
Even without explicit racial wording in the law itself. And he says some businesses supported minimum wages too, maybe to hurt competitors in lower wage areas.
Right, and he really pushes back against common ideas like the lump of labor fallacy.
Yeah, the idea that there's only a fixed number of jobs, he argues that's just wrong. And his main point on this is really powerful. That first job, even if it pays little, teaches invaluable things. How to find a job in the first place, showing up on time, workplace attitudes, self-respect, skills that are crucial for future success. Minimum wage laws, he argues, deny people those crucial first steps on the ladder. The problem isn't just underpaid, it's underskilled.
That really does reframe it. Okay, so if minimum wage is one barrier, what about the overall income gap? Chapter 4, right. Black median income stuck around 60% of white median income, even after civil rights laws.
Exactly. And here he throws in a fascinating, really attention-grabbing statistic that complicates the simple discrimination narrative.
Which is?
Get this. Black female college graduates back in 1960 earned a median income that was 102% of white female college graduates.
Wow, more.
More, and it was 91% in 1950. By 1970, black women as a group, outside the South anyway, had essentially reached economic parity with white women.
That's incredible, and completely different from the picture for black men.
Totally different, and that's the puzzle he tries to solve. If it was purely about race discrimination affecting everyone equally, why this huge difference between men and women?
So what's his explanation?
He points heavily towards differences in occupational distribution, especially for men, not just pay within the same job, but which jobs people were concentrated in.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In 1970, among male professionals, engineers pretty high-paying made up 18% of white professionals, but only 5% of black professionals.
Joy.
But look at non-university teachers, generally lower paying. That was 21% of black male professionals compared to only 12% of white male professionals.
I see. So even if pay was identical within engineering or within teaching, having fewer black men in the higher paying field and more in the lower paying one would drag down the overall black male median income.
Exactly. Now compare that to women. Non-university teaching was the biggest professional category for both black and white women, 46% for black women, 41% for white women. Much more similar distribution.
So the jobs they held were more alike.
Much more alike. He calculates a statistical measure, a rank correlation, showing much higher similarity for women's occupations than for men's. So his point is, a big chunk of that aggregate income gap, particularly for men, might come from these distributional differences, not just lower pay for the exact same work based on race.
That definitely adds a layer of complexity beyond just saying discrimination.
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, so then in chapters 5, 6, and 7, he moves on to another set of rules. occupational and business licensing.
Right, like needing a license to be a plumber or an electrician or a taxi driver.
Exactly. And these laws, he points out, are almost always administered by people already in the trade, the incumbents.
Which means they have an incentive to limit competition.
Precisely. For strict entry, keep the numbers down, which means fewer practitioners and, conveniently for them, higher prices for consumers. It benefits the license holders.
And he connects this historically to race.
Very directly. He details how licensing laws, especially in the skilled crafts like plumbing and electrical work, were explicitly used in the past to keep Black Americans out, often through things like biased or unfair exams, and unions often pushed for these laws.
Even if the intent isn't explicitly racist anymore, does he argue the effect lingers?
Yes, he does. He cites low percentages of Black members in major electrical and plumbing unions, even as late as the 1970s. And he talks about the Cadillac effect.
What's that?
High standards and high fees, driven by licensing, mean that only high-quality, expensive services are legally available. Great for the rich who can afford the Cadillac version, but the poor, they might be forced to just go without, or worse, try dangerous DIY stuff, like faulty electrical wiring causing fires.
That makes sense. He uses the taxi industry as a specific case study, right? New York City.
A classic example, yeah.
Yeah.
Chapter 6, he paints the picture. New York City, since 1937, had only issued about 11,700 taxi medallions, the license to operate a cab. By the time he was writing, the market price for one of those medallions was around $60,000.
$60,000.
Yeah.
Just to be allowed to drive a taxi you already own.
Exactly, an artificial monopoly created by the city government.
And what was the result, particularly in minority neighborhoods?
Well, the licensed medallion taxis often provided, quote, grossly inferior services, or sometimes just no service at all in poor, high-crime areas like Harlem or the South Bronx. It wasn't profitable or safe enough for them.
So what happened?
A whole industry of illegal or gypsy cabs sprang up, driven almost entirely by Black and Puerto Rican drivers, serving their own communities where the legal cabs wouldn't go. And interestingly, the authorities tended to look the other way, mostly ignoring them within those ghetto areas.
That's fascinating. And he contrasts this with Washington, D.C.
Stark contrast. D.C. at the time had basically open entry. You paid a small annual fee, maybe $25, and you could operate a cab.
And the result?
Lots of cabs, predominantly owner-operated, and about half the drivers were Black men. It fostered minority entrepreneurship, provided better service across the city, and kind of debunked all the arguments about needing strict limits for order or safety.
So his point is really powerful there. Historically, driving a cab was a classic way for immigrants, poor people, to get a foothold, right?
Yeah.
Buy a car, start earning.
Absolutely. Upward mobility. But today, in places like New York then, that $60,000 medallion fee, that path is just completely barricaded by government, as he puts it, for a poor person of any race.
Okay, so licensing is a huge barrier. Then he moves on to unions again, but this time linked with federal law, railroads, and trucking.
Right, chapters 8 and 9.
Mhm.
He shows how federal laws actually helped reinforce racially discriminatory union practices, especially on the railroads. He mentions the Steele Supreme Court case.
Where the court said unions had to represent everyone fairly.
Yeah, duty of fair representation. But Williams explains how, in practice, discrimination just continued using subtler techniques. Unions still held monopoly power, often granted by federal law, and historically, he says, unionization meant the redesignation of Negro jobs as white man's work.
And trucking. How did federal regulation play a role there?
Through the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, the Motor Carrier Act of 1935, which was actually pushed by the railroads trying to limit competition from trucks, created massive barriers to entry in interstate trucking.
Cow.
You needed a certificate of authority from the ICC. Getting one was incredibly expensive and difficult, involved huge legal battles against existing trucking companies who wanted to keep competitors out. He gives an example of one company spending hundreds of thousands just to apply for a license that would cost millions to buy from an existing holder.
Wow. And how does race fit into this?
Well, when these operating rights, these certificates, were essentially giving away under grandfather clauses back in 1935.
Minorities were hardly present in the industry then.
Exactly, so they were locked out from the start. Decades later, he cites data showing only something like 0.8% of ICC-authorized trucking firms were minority-owned.
And he draws a direct parallel between this and Jim Crow laws.
He does. He calls these severely restrictive entry criteria, these government-created trucking rules, fully as restrictive as the discredited practices of the Jim Crow system that barred entry into public facilities in many professions. It's a really stark comparison.
It is, and this leads him to be critical of things like affirmative action or set-asides.
Yeah, he sees those as second-best solutions. Maybe well-intentioned, but they're trying to fix problems created by the government's own regulations in the first place.
So the first best solution, in his view,
is just get rid of the initial barriers, eliminate the restrictive licensing, the regulations that block entry, let the market work.
This all culminates in his final chapter, Chapter 10, where he takes a broader look at economic freedom in the Constitution.
Right. He zooms out and talks about the historical American value of economic freedom, the right to work, tracing it back to the founders wanting to escape restrictive European systems.
And he focuses on how the Supreme Court's view of this changed over time, particularly the Due Process Clause.
Exactly. He shows how initially the court, in cases like Eligaier and Lochner, really emphasized liberty of contract, the idea that individuals have a fundamental right to make economic agreements, and the government couldn't interfere too much unless maybe a business was clearly affected with a public interest. Justice Pekin's words? The right to earn his livelihood by any lawful calling.
But that changed.
Big shift, yeah. Starting around the mid-1930s, cases like Nebbia and especially West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, the court basically abandoned that strong protection for liberty of contract.
What did they replace it with?
They dramatically expanded the government's police powers, its general authority to regulate for public welfare. And they essentially said, we're not going to question the wisdom or rationality of economic regulations anymore. That's up to the legislatures. The recourse became, as he puts it, resort to the polls, not to the courts.
So the practical result is?
The practical result, Williams argues, is that even though judges might still talk eloquently about liberty, the actual freedom to pursue an occupation, that right to work, has very little real legal protection anymore. States can impose regulations like that $60,000 taxi medallion that seem arbitrary and have little connection to a person's actual fitness for the job.
And he connects this back to civil rights law, Title VII.
He does, interestingly. He points to the Griggs v. Duke Tower case. That's the landmark case, saying employment practices, even if not intended to discriminate, are illegal if they have a discriminatory effect, if they act as built-in headwinds and aren't related to actual job performance. Williams suggests, well, maybe this same logic could be used to challenge many of these occupational licensing rules. If a licensing requirement doesn't actually relate to job capability, but it disproportionately screens out minorities,
then maybe it violates the principle established in Griggs.
That's the potential legal avenue he seems to hint at.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. Williams's core message, wrapping it up.
I think the core message is that just focusing on racial hatred or individual prejudice misses a huge part of the picture.
Yeah.
The cost of discriminating matters, and government intervention, these rules of the game, often reduces or eliminates the cost of discrimination. It can even make discrimination profitable for incumbent groups.
Right, and he contrasts how the market works versus the political system.
Yeah, that's a key contrast. The market, he argues, is more like $1, one vote, maybe.
Yeah.
Even if you have fewer dollars, they still have power.
Yeah.
His example, people in poor neighborhoods can still use the market to buy decent cars, clothes, food.
But in the political arena,
That's driven by majority rule, by interest groups. Minorities, or the poor, can be completely outvoted or ignored. They might get none of what they want. Think poor quality public schools in ghettos, or zoning laws in suburbs that effectively block poorer people, often minorities, from moving in even if they could afford some housing there.
he uses that landlord's dilemma example too, right? To show market forces overcoming prejudice.
Yeah, how historically poor black families were sometimes able to outbid richer white families for housing in central city areas simply because they were willing to pay more rent per square foot, maybe by doubling up. The landlord's desire for profit overcame their potential racial preference.
But zoning laws prevent that kind of market outcome in the suburbs.
Exactly. The government rule blocks the market mechanism that might otherwise overcome prejudice.
So he leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought, doesn't he?
He really does. He asks us to imagine, what if the Supreme Court started treating the right to work, economic freedom, with the same seriousness, the same level of protection that it gives to freedom of speech?
Because he argues there aren't many truly compelling state reasons to limit most people's freedom to just work at a chosen occupation.
Right. So the question he leaves hanging is what might happen? What opportunities could open up not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans if these government-created barriers to economic participation were actually dismantled?
A powerful question to end on,
Mm.
and a challenging perspective throughout the book.
Definitely challenges conventional wisdom. A really important read, regardless of whether you ultimately agree with all of it.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on Books and Bites.
My pleasure.